we're going to have a discussion about the state of online terrorist content removal policy in the United States. Sort of our goal for this event is to try to feature perspectives that, at least in the US discussion, we don't typically hear. Because I think predominantly, especially in the United States, a lot of the discussions we've been hearing about the roles, respectively, of the US government and the private sector in managing terrorist content online have been predominantly centered around what the US government could be doing in terms of regulating tech companies' terms of service enforcement decisions. So in that vein of featuring some alternative perspectives on this discussion, we'll hear a little bit about, number one, what the current state of research on the so-called online radicalization problem in the United States tells us about content removal policy. Second, how those working on content removal policies and enforcement decisions view the specter of governmental regulation. And then finally, how the experiences of other countries in devising their regulatory environments for online terrorist content can help inform the United States' approach. Before I introduce our panelists for today, I have some quick housekeeping notes. Our event in total will run for about an hour today. Our panelists will start by giving some brief remarks at first. That should take about a half an hour. And then after that, there will be time for Q&A. And you can use, as always, the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen in the chat, and I will try to answer questions in the order that I get them, and hope we have enough time. I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions for our panelists today, so we'll hope that we can be able to get through all of them today in the remaining about half an hour and so of the chat. So without further ado, today we are delighted to be joined by Joe Whitaker. Joe is a lecturer in cyber threats at Swansea University. His PhD is focused on the online behaviors of Islamic State-affiliated terrorists in the United States between 2012 and 2018. And he's also a research fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism in The Hague. We're also joined by Chris McGuffey. She is an extremism and disinformation researcher with a background in international security and non-proliferation. She's the research director at Spectrum Labs, where her work informs the development of artificial intelligence and related solutions to mitigate harms and elevate civility across online communities. And then finally, we have Jacob Bernstein, the head of policy and research at Tech Against Terrorism. He leads a team of 9 analysts, oversees the programmatic delivery of the organization's work across open source intelligence analysis, research and policy and advisory and response mechanisms for tech companies. And he also holds a master's degree from King's College London. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to our first presenter. So Joe, take it away.
Thank you very much, Bennett. So yeah, as Bennett said, I'm Joe Whitaker, I work at Swansea University, and my main research interests are thinking about this concept of online radicalization. So my PhD, which is mostly what I'm going to talk about today, and some articles that have come as a result of it, I basically built a big database of terrorists, IS terrorists within the US. Massive hat tip to the program on extremism because their repository was incredibly important as part of that. And just tried to establish in what way is online radicalization a useful way of thinking about contemporary terrorist trajectories. I'm also quite interested in recommendation systems and how they may or may not promote extremist content. Happy to talk about that if that fits in a bit later on, as well as things like video games and counter-narratives too. But I thought worthwhile starting just on the kind of basic concept. So online radicalization, very clearly on both sides of the Atlantic, is a real key policy priority concern. So, on the US side, we've had, interagency working groups and over various different administrations in the United States. In the United Kingdom, or just in the EU in general, we've had joint statements between prime ministers and presidents highlighting this as a key threat, both in the context of the rise and fall of the Islamic State, as well as the current threat from the far right as well. I think it's also fair to say that it's certainly something of a pressed moral panic right now. So the New York Times is certainly one that I've got particular issue with. A lot of very misleading headlines, like YouTube, the great radicalizer, or the new radicalization of the internet and things like that. As spoken about as if the internet almost has radicalizing agency and forgetting that there are humans involved at both ends of this kind of communication. But I think actually when we dig a little bit deeper at the concept of online radicalization, it's pretty ambiguous as a concept. It's not really clear how much or what kind of internet activity constitutes radicalizing online. In fact, and this is a bit of an academic ivory tower point, but I'm not even sure really what constitutes being online in 2022 either, but maybe that's one for the discussion afterwards. But to give a whistle-stop tour of the research in this area is terrorists use the internet a lot. Of course they do. Terrorists are human beings, and we all use the internet a lot. They use it for almost every part of their activity, just like most human beings. And as a result of, I think, that quite on the face of it observation, policy has very clearly turned around and emphasized content removal as a clear policy direction of travel, particularly on my side of the Atlantic. So again, whether it's the EU recently passing directives to fine social media companies if terror content isn't removed from platforms, I think up to 4% of global revenues are really serious fines, to things like the Christchurch call, which the US is a signatory towards, but we'll talk a little bit about difference in free speech norms, obviously, in a second. All the way to things like the Internet Referral Unit, which is part of Europol. But yeah, the US has obviously taken quite a different approach, has considerably different free speech norms, and that might create something of a fault line, which I think I might roll back to towards the end. But just to talk about my own empirical research a little bit. So as I mentioned, I created this database to try and assess whether individuals are radicalizing online. And I think the first thing I found was that, first of all, as I mentioned, terrorists are using the internet. I found evidence of about over 9 in 10 of the terrorists in that data set were using the internet as a key part of their plot. But I think quite interestingly, it is not replacing the offline domain. What we can very clearly see is that offline social networks, offline communication, offline planning still remains a really important aspect of what's going on here. To take that even one step further, despite all of the reasons for talking about removing policy and the ways in which terrorists can exploit the internet, there may be good reason to think that the internet may be some kind of an impediment to success for a lot of terrorists. A lot of terrorists are recklessly telegraphing their intentions online, and it is low-hanging fruit for law enforcement to open investigations against them using this kind of content, removing it from platforms may start to be problematic. And just one more thing on my own research is in a follow-up piece of work done with my co-author Shameen, we used a cluster analysis to try and look at these 231 terrorists and see if we could discern from their online and offline behaviors whether we saw any kind of distinct kind of pathways. And what we found was, rather than thinking about online or offline, is that we kind of put it on a spectrum instead, and we identified 4 different pathways, all the way from pretty heavy internet use to pretty mixed between online and offline, all the way to people that were very isolated, didn't really have online or offline networks. And I think what this really demonstrates is bucketing concepts into these binary ideas of online or offline radicalization don't really pass the smell test. So I think, going back to this idea of content removal, I think the first thing, having spoken about being quite skeptical of the idea of online radicalization, is that, first of all, content removal might simply be looking in the wrong place. If it is used as a counterterrorism policy, there may be some reasons to think that if we are emphasizing the importance of offline discussions, offline networks, other kinds of offline planning, that simply trying to remove content from the internet is only ever going to be a relatively small piece of the puzzle. But perhaps more concerning is that it may be helping terrorists. If we are forcing terrorists to platforms in which they do have greater operational security than they would on mainstream social media platforms, then taking that kind of content from social media may be inadvertently helping them. But in the same vein, it may be spurring innovation in some kind of a way. When we look at the contemporary online terrorist ecosystem, what we can see is kind of multi-platform approaches in which terrorists have learned to adapt in a very hostile environment. Now, that's obviously got to be weighed against the fact that clearly we can see that there are some benefits from content removal. We only need to look at the state of IS supporters online after tech companies started removing them. But I think it's important to be cognizant about some of the unintended consequences. So I think I'm fast approaching the end of my 10 minutes. So I'll leave with just going back to that idea of the transatlantic difference between these kind of free speech norms when it comes to the removal of content. So typically, and I know I'm not a First Amendment scholar, but typically the US has been far less enthusiastic about passing laws that restrict terror content. We can talk about Brandenburg versus Ohio. We can talk about not having hate speech laws, which are often the mood music for this kind of thing. And social media platforms started their life much more with this kind of mindset. Twitter used to call itself the free speech wing of the free speech party. But in about the middle part of the last decade, the tech companies started taking an approach which is much more consistent with European free speech norms. Now, I think that this leaves us with a very interesting question when it comes to terrorism within the United States, that if research like my own suggests that content removal may be hampering the ability of law enforcement to conduct investigations, then all of a sudden, the state of content removal in the US is kind of being dragged by its heels with European set of free speech values, which social media companies are following in the wake of things like this EU directive, which promises them very big fines. Now, I'm not taking a position necessarily either way on it, but I think it's very interesting that this has been a complete reversal in the space of about 10 years. So I think with that, I'm happy to pass back over.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me to participate today, Bennett. Preventing and countering violent extremism, for better or worse, has landed in the laps of technology platforms in some respects, as Joe has pointed out. So let's address what that really means for all of us. Good policy requires solid analysis of how diverse platforms are exploited by bad actors and how violent extremist content is actually detected and moderated. It also requires the US, if we're talking about US policy specifically, to evaluate much more thoroughly its approach to online harms, to human rights, and to the limitations of content removal regulation itself, which Joe has pointed out very accurately. What we've seen so far with online content policy is that even with very good faith efforts, there is a fair amount of unintended consequences for users and platforms. And we've learned that regulation doesn't always result in fewer harms to people or even necessarily a lower volume of unwanted content persisting online. There's also the larger violent extremism stance to consider. Terrorist content removal online can't be divorced from assessing where any particular government sits in terms of other countering violent extremism efforts. So the US in particular, we have further to go than some other Western nations in terms of well-coordinated prevention and mitigation efforts. Our current challenges with managing domestic violent extremism are just one of several examples of how we've yet to really establish a proper framework. This means that we don't have an overarching prevention approach that we could actually use to guide terrorist content removal regulation in the US specifically. To create sustainable policy, we need realistic definitions. A lot of us in the field chuckle about definitions because we cannot even agree on essential definitions sometimes. What is violent extremism? What is terrorism? What are the associated behaviors, particularly online? So this is why a harms-based approach actually works better than one that's largely based on just identifying terrorist groups and what we might traditionally think of as their propaganda, that low-hanging fruit that Joe referenced. If there's one major lesson we've learned about terrorism and the violent extremist groups and movements that fuel it, it's that group membership and support and affiliation is not necessarily central to how propaganda spreads and influences people to commit violence in terms of the online construct. So by considering regulation in terms of actual harms to people, and while considering universal human rights, we can cut through a lot of the unnecessary noise around content removal debates that we're hearing right now. From historical examples, we actually know long before the internet was created that extremist content hate speech, harmful content has resulted in horrific violence. Nazi Germany, the Bosnian War, Rwanda, there are too many examples of this. And I am intentionally aligning hate speech with violent extremist movements because they go hand in hand and they feed one another. We know how certain types of speech, especially speech that's based on disinformation, on false information, can incite violence. And encourage hate and discrimination. And it's happening right now with the bombardment and invasion of Ukraine. So in our attempts to regulate, we actually can balance human dignity and human rights with free speech. As Joe mentioned, the US endorsement of the Christchurch call and other endorsements of that have actually been really helpful because that outlines a whole of society approach. We need to be really realistic about who has the resources to manage online platforms, how to encourage governments and platforms and everyday users to play their part. So here's the good news in all of this, at least from my perspective. We already know about countering violent extremism. We know about propaganda. We understand influence. The expertise exists for all of this. Governments are particularly adept at understanding influence operations, perpetuating them. Technology companies have specialized tools. Large social media entities have a lot of resources. So tech and government can actually partner with subject matter experts who understand countering violent extremism and pair that with the unique qualities of online behaviors. It matters a lot less whether harmful content is actually shared by a bad actor who's a member of an established violent extremist group or terrorist group, or if that content is being shared by a supporter, because the impact of that content itself is what we actually know is going on in the real world. It's influencing people who are mobilizing into violence, and that's why we're here talking about this. This is why it's such a problem. So we can actually rely upon existing knowledge about extremist ideologies, but also more importantly in this space, identities, because identities are packaged like commodities. Those identities are marketed, they're promoted, and they're glorified online in ways to inspire people who have not even undergone what most of us would consider a full radicalization process to take violent action. So finally, to get into the nuts and bolts a little bit at the end here about how this works in the moderation space, any policy that's going to be fruitful will require a more accurate understanding of how AI and other technologies work, especially with specific types of structural and staffing approaches to moderating terrorist content. The speed and the scale of all of this is honestly more than most of us can wrap our heads around, even if we're working in moderation. So anyone writing policy has a huge job to get up to speed in terms of how this actually works. We do have a pretty informative recent example. We know what happened with the so-called Islamic State when tech platforms cracked down. They deplatformed them from major social media entities. They cut back on the proliferation of gory videos and other kind of similar branded content. And so we have these great capacities we've developed, especially when it comes to images. But where we still have a lot of work to do is persuasive content that's in the form of masked and coded and memeified propaganda. And a lot of that content that truly influences human beings to do terrible things is subtle. It's clever, it's repetitive. It moves across a whole bunch of platforms in the same time period, particularly within echo chambers. We all know how echo chambers work in terms of actually transforming ideas into action. So to get to examples, we know during the pandemic, QAnon, anti-Asian hate speech and violence against Asian Americans, and the January 6th insurrection are all examples of what really metastasized during that time period. If we choose to, we're going to learn a tremendous amount about online influence and regulation from what's happening right now in terms of people being charged for offenses related to the insurrection. As with most security policy, we need carrots and sticks. People need incentives to behave better. We need also to deter truly bad actors. We need the same types of expertise and the same types of diverse toolkits that are required in other security settings. There has to be ongoing analysis of truth on the ground, and then the structures and systems in place to actually deploy the tools, and most importantly, to get the analysis into the hands of decision makers who are well trained and understand all of this stuff. With AI detection, that requires training on the right type of data to identify all the nuanced behaviors I've mentioned across all the languages and all the cultures where they're needed. So you need people who can understand those languages and understand the cultures, understand the tactics and the content. And then those same people, the analysts who look at this, have to adapt to the changes occurring. And those changes occur rapidly with things like political changes, war, natural disasters, pandemics. All of this requires an actual commitment to ongoing research and analysis and a lot of resources. So good policy would reflect all of these realities, along with an understanding that there are many types of platforms. It's not just giant social media entities. A lot of the platforms involved in this actually have much smaller budgets, many fewer people working on these problems. And so bottom line, we don't want to regulate ourselves into a situation where only the largest and best funded platforms can even exist online, because the internet has put knowledge and power into our hands at an unprecedented level. We have access to information and human connection. And those are benefits that we don't want to toss out in the rush to punish the large social media entities for their complicity and harms. So in summary, collaborative approaches, truly understanding how different functions actually are working together within platforms and between different actors, how we use technology and play in ways that are not one size fits all. And in that way, we can actually start to reduce the amount of content and reduce the overall amount of harm. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you, Chris and Joe, for your excellent presentations. Before we continue on, very briefly, I'll interject here before Jacob does his presentation to say as well, please put any questions that you have for our panelists today in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. They'll answer pretty much anything. See some questions down there already. Yeah, please put any questions you have there. Otherwise, I'll have to ask questions, and it's probably not the best use of our time here today. So please shoot any questions you have to our panelists, and I'll turn it over to Jacob.
Thanks, Bennett, and thanks to Joe and Chris for some really excellent presentations. I certainly agree with a lot of what you said. So hopefully there's some smart points for me left to make in my presentation. Hopefully you can see and hear me, and you can see the screen as well. So today, I mean, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I think it's really important that we talk about regulation in a setting, of counterterrorism researchers as well, because I think it's really important that we have that perspective going into regulatory debates. And that's, as I'll get to in a second, that is something that we feel Attack Against Terrorism is often missing. Today, I'll talk briefly about some research that we did on emerging global online regulation. I'll try to be as high level as I can, and hopefully we can get into some specifics in the discussion. Just briefly before I start, on Tech Against Terrorism, we are a public-private partnership that works with the global tech industry to tackle terrorist use of the internet whilst respecting human rights. Bit of a mouthful, but what it means in practice is that we carry out activities around open source intelligence and threat assessments. We build tooling and software to help platforms moderate terrorist content more quickly and more effectively. And we do a lot of knowledge sharing around terrorist use of the internet and how tech companies can help, can improve the response in this area. So we've built a knowledge sharing platform, for example, where we have a mentorship program for tech companies. And it's part of this work stream that we've done some of the regulatory analysis that I'll talk about now. So essentially, over 2020 and 2021, we carried out a research project called the Online Regulation Series. In this piece of work, we looked at online regulation in 29 different global jurisdictions, and we looked at more than 120 different pieces of regulation. The aim of this work was to support smaller tech companies in helping them understand this emerging and increasingly complex field, and we felt like it was important for us as practitioners in the counterterrorism space to really support platforms in this regard, particularly since terrorist content is often used as a type of vanguard content with regards to online regulation, along with child sexual abuse material, for example. Terrorist content is often the justification for a lot of new regulation that we're seeing globally. So in doing so, we consulted counterterrorism legislation, criminal legislation, and online content regulation as well. And before I move on, I should also caveat this by saying that I'm not a lawyer, we're not lawyers, we are practitioners working with tech platforms to help them understand this. So a lot of the findings that we present will be informed by that. So in terms of the trends that we're seeing in emerging online regulation, we have identified 7 overarching trends in this area. So the first one is that, and Chris touched upon this as well, so big tech is often the target of this regulation, but it still creates a lot of requirements that small platforms are expected to be able to meet as well. There are some notable exceptions. For example, in the EU Digital Services Act, there are some size differences in requirements depending on the platform size. And similarly, there are also some differences in such requirements in regulation that we've seen in India and Pakistan as well. Secondly, like Joe mentioned, we are seeing increasing that removal deadlines are being used. So for example, authorities and governments can request and demand that platforms remove specific types of content, sometimes terrorist content, within a certain time frame. And if they fail to do so, they risk financial punishment. So in the EU terrorist content online regulation, which is set to come into force this summer, the deadline is 1 hour. But we have also seen in other jurisdictions longer time frames. So for example, in Turkey, it's 4 hours, and in Germany and Australia and Pakistan, it's 24 hours. So this is a trend that is happening globally. Likewise, we are seeing increased reliance on automated moderation being incentivized. Sorry. Sometimes this is implicit. So for example, platforms might feel compelled to introduce automated content moderation, such as AI or machine learning solutions, because they feel like they need to use this in order to meet the deadlines that have been set out for them. Or as in the case with the EU terrorist content online regulation, authorities can actually instruct companies to also introduce automated solutions. We're also seeing that the adjudication of content legality is to some extent being outsourced to tech companies as opposed to the judicial system. So what this means is that tech platforms are actually in charge of deciding and assessing what is legal and illegal. So in Germany, under the NetzDG Act, for example, tech companies are responsible for assessing reported content against the German law as opposed to the courts. And likewise, this is something that the US audience will be familiar with. We are seeing introduced an increasing platform liability for user-generated content. Obviously, in the US, there's the whole discussion around Section 230 and the sort of massive influx of new regulation that seeks to amend Section 230. But we are also seeing this across other jurisdictions, and that includes jurisdictions in Europe, but also in other jurisdictions. Such as in India, Indonesia, and the UK as well. And 6, we're also seeing that a lot of jurisdictions are requiring in-country presence or a physical office. And this is something that we have seen in countries such as France, Germany, Pakistan, Kenya, Turkey, and Russia. And obviously this can be good in the sense that it might help tech companies understand their local markets better, but there have been concerns raised by civil society that these are effectively hostage-taking laws that are being used to exert influence on tech companies. And lastly, we are seeing increasingly that governments are mandating transparency reporting requirements for tech companies. And this is something that we have seen in jurisdictions such as France, the UK, and the EU, as well as Pakistan. So just briefly before I move on, as you can see, there are some fairly sizable overlap with regards to how countries and jurisdictions think about this. So this is an excerpt from the handbook that we created on online regulation. So as you can see, there are quite a few notable similarities, but also differences in how jurisdictions go about thinking about online regulation. with regards to some of the concerns that we have at Tech Against Terrorism around the increasingly fragmented online regulatory landscape that we're seeing globally, we identify 6 specific concerns that we think are important to raise and hopefully can inform US policy thinking in this area as well. So firstly, we think that there's to some extent a myopia in the focus on big tech, and that a lot of the regulation that we're seeing is lacking consideration for smaller tech platform capacity and capability. So there might certainly be very good reasons to target big tech, but if you create regulation that only big tech companies can comply with, you obviously risk harming innovation and competition and thereby making larger platforms more powerful. I think it's important, and Chris touched upon this as well, the internet is diverse. It's a whole range of platforms. Facebook is not the internet, so we shouldn't regulate the internet as if that's the case. And this also brings me to my second point around our concerns about much of this regulation not being effective in achieving its intended purpose. So, we obviously, a lot of the regulation that we're seeing, it seems to be based on a perceived threat picture of the fact that of an assumption that a lot of terrorist activity is still only occurring on some of the larger tech platforms. But as professionals in this space, I think most of you will know that that's simply not the case anymore. We see that a lot of threat activity has migrated to either smaller platforms or onto new alt tech platforms. Recently, we published a report on terrorist operated websites where we found that more than 200 terrorist operated websites exist on the surface web. So in that sense, much of this regulation doesn't really seem to account for that type of adversarial shift. Likewise, we are concerned around the fact that a lot of these regulations have very vague definitions, and there's a lack of clarity in the definitions in many of the laws and proposals that we have examined. So obviously, this makes it really difficult for tech platforms to operationalize regulation, and also, as you may imagine, this might lead to quite severe restrictions of freedom of expression as well. Fourth, we are also concerned around the fact that there seems to be a lack of transparency regarding what evidence drives regulatory efforts. Here, lawmakers really aren't very good at sort of providing evidence why certain provisions are needed. For example, why is it needed? Why is it 1 hour or a 4-hour or 24-hour removal deadline required? It makes total sense that you want this to be removed quickly, right? But it'd be good to see some more transparency in what the actual sort of thinking is from policymakers in this area. Likewise, I think there's generally a lack of consultation with civil society and counterterrorism experts. And I think that counterterrorism experts should certainly get more involved and be made to be involved by policymakers in these discussions, because I do think that will help make regulation more effective. And here I would like to give a shout out to Canada, who I think yesterday announced that they have a new expert group that consists of a couple of really notable counterterrorism experts and legal experts that will help them think through their emerging online regulatory scheme. Likewise, we are concerned that there is undermining of rule of law occurring and conventional norms. So, for example, I mentioned the outsourcing of content legality adjudication. By doing so, we obviously risk making tech platforms more powerful in that they get to decide what counts as legal and illegal. Surely this is something that should sit with democratically accountable institutions and not unaccountable big tech companies. Likewise, we're also seeing in some jurisdictions that countries are introducing measures that are based on national law, but will need to apply globally. So, for example, in Brazil and Pakistan, we're seeing mandates being introduced forcing companies to remove content based on national speech codes, but to remove that globally, which obviously violates principles of territoriality. And last, and perhaps most importantly, unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of democratic nation states setting a really poor precedents in this regard. So we, in our analysis, many of the democratic and Western governments that are introducing online regulation are doing so in a way that civil society and activists have called out for being potentially detrimental in terms of human rights and freedom of expression online. And unfortunately, we are seeing a lot of non-democratic states seeking to emulate such legislation, or at least justifying their own sometimes more draconian legislation based on the fact that they're seeing such legislation being introduced elsewhere. And there's been a number of examples of countries in, for example, Mauritania, Russia, and Uganda have all justified their regulation by citing European regulation in this regard. And there is a reason why, and this, along with other facts, of course, are one reason why Freedom House, in their most recent Freedom of the Net survey, actually found that online regulation is a big contributor to the fact that internet freedoms have decreased for the 11th year in a row now. So we really hope that democratic nation states should, consider this more carefully and really try to set a better example in this regard. Before I hand back to Bennett, I just want to give a bit of a plug. Much of the research that I've cited is available on our website, but on our knowledge sharing platform at ksb.techagainstterrorism.org, you can actually find all of these laws that I've been talking about. They are centralized on this platform, which is publicly available for everyone who's interested. So hopefully that was useful. And with that, I'll pass back to Bennett.
Yeah, Jacob, thank you very much. And I see we have a number of excellent questions in the Q&A part, so we'll get to those now. Starting off, a question for all of you, if you have any thoughts about sort of Facebook's policy on providing praise for the Azov battalion in Ukraine being viewed as legitimate. But I'd like to broaden out this question a little bit to deal and maybe talk a little bit more, get each of your insights on the tricky situation you get into where a platform has identified an organization that's promoting, I guess, using whatever mechanism you'd like to call it, either dangerous or in some cases terrorist content that is not formally designated by the country that is under its jurisdiction. So how platforms would govern an organization like the Azov Battalion, which, despite a lot of its ideology, a lot of its claims, et cetera, is not yet designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the US or, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe by the European Union or other governments as well.
So I'm afraid I'm not a Russia expert, so I can't answer the Azov question in particular. I think one thing that is interesting that I think links from both that question and Bennett's extension is exactly which parameters the social media platforms are using to start to remove and restrict content, because there's actually a bit of a divergence between some platforms that are far more focused with the actual content itself and other platforms that are considerably more interested in the source of the content. I was quite surprised at that decision well, again, I don't know the ins and outs of that, but Facebook's approach is generally much more focused around the people who are delivering the content. And if you look through their rules and their terms of service and things like that, they make numerous references to online, to groups that are tied to offline violence and things like that. So that the way that that's phrased is, for example, a criteria for a group not to be recommended, or content that relates to a group not to be recommended. So without being able to specifically answer the question, I think that's a really interesting intersection in thinking about how we deal with it. And putting the online radicalization question back on it, I think it is really interesting because all of a sudden now we're expanding this far beyond the scope of potentially radicalizing content when we're just thinking about the authors or the sources of the information. So I'm minded to think back to the decision of YouTube to remove every single one of Anwar al-Awlaki's videos, even the ones that had nothing to do with jihad and were just about how to pray, how to eat, and things like that. And I think that speaks to a lot of what the other panelists are talking about in terms of potential overreach and some pretty difficult democratic questions being asked.
Yeah, and I mean, I would sort of echo much of what Joe has said, and also just really emphasize that if we're talking about designation and what sort of guidelines that governments can provide, this is extremely muddled and unclear, and is something that we deal with on a fairly regular basis at Tech Against Terrorism. So we, admitting to sort of all the flaws that exist with global designation practices and this quite severe human rights impact they could have for individuals and for groups, we think that designation does have the potential to be really useful here in terms of providing guidance to tech companies. We have had a number of cases where we've worked with, let's just say, platforms that don't always are receptive to feedback on what content they should remove due to their own sort of philosophies around this. They often budge when we can sort of point to sort of a clear legal basis, i.e. designation. So this is an effective tool that it's not just a matter of sort of academic debate. It does have actual practical impact. The problem is that so many different countries use so many different systems, and they're not always very transparent about which exact groups are designated. I mean, this was even with the case of the Taliban last summer. This was sort of put on display. There was a lot of confusion as to whether the US had or hadn't designated the Taliban. So governments can really help companies with providing some clarity as to what groups and what content should be disallowed. And I think that's the sort of key gap at the moment. There obviously a lot of countries have their own designation lists, but it's very unclear what implications there are for online content and online speech. So that's sort of a clear gap that I think governments can address.
As I mentioned in my talking points, what people are doing online and how it actually impacts others is really what, this is the landscape I live in every day. And so praising violent ideologies, praising people affiliated with groups that are centered around hateful beliefs, none of this is good for society. And as we all know, in terms of actual group designations, or even the way groups merge and reform and rebrand themselves extremely quickly because they know how this works, it slows everything down. So, even to give a kind of slightly unrelated example, but it's one that is problematic, at least in the United States, there was a lot of hateful wishing harm on people during the pandemic based on their view of vaccination. And regardless of how you feel about other people's decisions and beliefs, if you're wishing harm on others and you're promoting this sense that people can be dehumanized because of certain attributes or belief systems, none of this goes well. And we all know where it ends up. And so it goes way beyond any policy about any group. It's really problematic speech that can turn into other people getting hurt.
Yeah, I think all of those are good points. And I'd also just briefly add as well that I think over the past couple of years, you've seen the emergence of this dynamic that because essentially a lot of the responsibility for determining what falls under the definition of harmful content, or in this case, terrorist content, has fallen onto tech companies and fallen into the private sector. At least with major tech companies, you get a strange kind of perception where actually their designations are a lot more expansive than what the federal government can do just in the United States, just because of the result of the constraints in the designation process here. And it leads to interesting thing. A couple months ago, there was the publicization of Meta's sort of dangerous organizations tier classification list and some of those concerns. And I think it was interesting to see, for instance, the scope of different types of dangerous organizations and individuals that they could address vis-a-vis what the U.S. designated foreign terrorist organization looks like as well, which, maybe from some standpoints, it's not right or not productive for the tech companies to be making those types of decisions about designation as well. But it's a kind of the natural result of the situation that we find ourselves in based off the interplay between the government and the tech center. The tech companies, excuse me. I'm gonna group together a couple of questions that I see in the chat about the role of automation and artificial intelligence. The first one discusses, I guess, how that's affecting translation, so the ability to identify content in maybe harmful content in different language and broaden the reach that moderators have other kind of parts of the world where maybe they would have needed additional staff power, human staff power in the past to address. And the second way I think is interesting, which is just the question of how extremists are adapting and sidestepping the increased automation of content removal processes, and what that heralds for making these types of policies in the future. The questioner here is asking about things like using emojis or coded language instead of regular language in order to avoid some of the automated detectors as well. So interested to hear each of your perspectives on any or all of that bigger picture question.
Well, I can start off by sharing some thoughts on a very small part of the language question. So I'm currently compiling kind of an evidence base on what we know about recommendation systems and extremist content. And there's some really interesting pieces of research that do suggest that while platforms may have started to get slightly more sophisticated at detecting and stopping recommendations for English language content, that when we get into the realm of other types of other languages, that they may be substantially less successful at doing so. So I think that begins to start to paint a picture that clearly these companies are all English language focused first, and we quite often see whenever, for example, when YouTube are rolling out a new policy, they'll do it in America first, then they'll roll it out to Europe, and then they'll bring it out to the rest of the world. So there is probably good reason to think that where automation has become quite successful at detecting English language content and perhaps some of the nuances that can be conveyed in English because the vast majority of their staff speak those languages, we may be lagging behind in other countries. And particularly we can look at cases like in Burma, Myanmar, where particularly Facebook was very slow at stopping it because they just had no language skills in that kind of realm.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and talk about this. Again, this is what I do every day. I think there are some misconceptions about automation in particular, and about some of these technologies. Artificial intelligence is only as intelligent as we make it. It requires a lot of different types of people to increase the intelligence, whether you're talking about new leet speak tactics, or whether you're talking about language, but like just take language in and of itself. Of course, we need capacities and diverse languages and cultures, but we also need to actually understand how people communicate. Most of us actually communicate online in ways that we don't speak to one another formally. And this is a way we actually connect. So the very ways that we connect and joke with one another and signal that we understand one another is what makes this really complex. So the translation abilities that we have developed are fantastic, but they always require humans in the loop. On multiple levels. And then the real world happens and Russia invades Ukraine, and there's a whole new set of issues with languages that maybe were not as dominant in certain places, with historical constructs and allusions to content that everyone who's involved has to get up to speed with very quickly. So you need all of that working together optimally. And sometimes you realize that you don't necessarily have the right structure in place. And so a small platform may realize, oh my goodness, we have a huge leap forward because we didn't anticipate this type of problem. And to even deal with deploying tools and people to puzzle crack this, we need to do a ton of work in a small amount of time, and we need that expertise, which is why joining together people who are already working on this is so important, because we can't expect that people can magic this up. It's not how it works. The technology is really, really amazing, and the people who actually build it and tweak it are really smart people. But it requires all of us working together to actually make the adjustments so that it swims along nicely. And I just want to demystify that, hey, we've got AI. All you have to do is buy some AI and it works. And then once you have it, nothing ever changes. It remains static, and it always works, because that's just not the reality of how this works or any security situation works.
Yeah, and if I can just come in there and sort of pull it back to regulation and regulatory approaches to this, I mean, just to touch on Chris's last point there, I think sometimes there seems to be a perception with policymakers, and I'm going to steal this from a scholar called Evelyn Dweck, who policymakers seems to think that tech companies can just nerd harder and everything will be fine, and it's just not that simple, right? So there's no magic button like stop terrorism button either. So I think what needs to happen is to some extent is a bit of a shift in terms of where we move away from this notion that content moderation, and especially content moderation at scale, if we're talking about these large tech companies, that it's essentially impossible to get right. There will always be mistakes, there will always be trade-offs. So you need to then decide which mistakes are we willing to accept and which sort of error rates are we willing to accept, and what trade-offs should we focus on. And that's why I personally think that the sort of more process-centered regulatory approaches, such as the EU Digital Services Act, and I mean, not as good of an example, but at least it has the same aim, the UK Online Safety Bill, which focuses on the procedural aspects of this, is a better approach, because then we can, instead of punishing companies for failing to remove specific pieces of content, you can focus on making them more transparent. You can focus on holding them accountable for their practices and exactly the kind of solutions that Chris was just talking about. So I think that's probably a big lesson that I think is starting to get some more traction in these circles, but hopefully it will continue to do so as well.
I wonder if what you just mentioned, Jacob, in conjunction with the other comments, is a reflection of sort of our designed policy goals for offline counterterrorism creeping into the online counterterrorism world, where it's this perception of a zero-fail mission, and sort of our understanding that even letting one terrorist attack happen in the offline world is an intelligence or a policy failure, and that sort of spilling over to how policymakers look at instances of terrorist content or terrorist exploitation of platforms online. I think it looks like we have time for one more question. And this is a rather large question, so I hope we're able to answer it during the last few minutes of this panel. The question is about nation-state support for online extremist or online terrorist content and propaganda models as well, and the role that plays. Is it an essential factor of what we see today in terms of the nexus between nation states and terrorist groups? And then the second part of the question is whether that's led to anything about the normalization or acceptability of terrorist content online today.
I mean, I've got little to say on this one, except that it's just that normative question about the definition of terrorism. I mean, going back to the first question of the Q&A, is that if we're talking about Russia supporting neo-Nazi groups, then that seems very much, I mean, we've seen the same from several states that we happen to deem to be bad actors. So in that sense, yes, but yeah, for the most part, it's not necessarily as I wouldn't say it is a huge part of the kind of mainstream ecosystem right now.
I would say that what is a bit more common is actual violent extremists exploiting what states are putting out there. It works in multiple directions, but in terms of like the everyday content, just, we have to bring it back to like human beings exploiting opportunities, aligning themselves within situations and aligning themselves with content that suits their purposes. And it doesn't even matter quite so much who's behind it, how much money, yes, sometimes in terms of coordination, but you can imagine when there are multiple actors who have nefarious purposes, who are all in this space exploiting it, then you have greater complexity, and it's simply a matter of like, how can we undo harms in a realistic way? Because when you're sorting through massive amounts of content, you really just need to deal with getting further along with removal, identification, if there are a small number of users involved. And so, of course, people are people, and some people do bad things and they exploit opportunities, but really just the more complexity in the situation, like with Ukraine, the more we have to sort through and just figure out what's going on and how to deal with it very rapidly.
Jacob, you're going to take a stab at this one, or all set?
I don't think I have much to add. I think like Joe's point around definitions and designation is a good one. I think that's a I think that's a valuable observation. I think like and also to Chris's point, we are seeing maybe not strictly designated terrorist groups, but certainly extremist and violent extremist groups, like certainly making use and sometimes overlapping with mainstream politicians in their talking points, right? I mean, which is sad and depressing in and of its own, right? But that's obviously that's a bit of a Pandora's box to open in terms of how we're going to sort of what sort of restrictions we're going to and distinctions we're going to make there between what should be permissible and what shouldn't, especially when mainstream politicians are guilty of the exact same offensive speech as some extremist groups are.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are all good points there. And I would only add as well, as each of you, I'm absolutely sure, can testify to as well, being in extremist online spaces carries a very prolific rate of, I guess you could call it, friendly fire, in terms of the amount of different actors with different understandings, different kind of goals, different perspectives, all being in the same place. If you're in any sort of group or platform or channel in which there's a congregation of extremist groups, you can also expect to find nation state actors, folks from law enforcement, interested observers, et cetera, and sorting out the discourse in one of those kind of arenas for exactly contextualizing it to who belongs to what or what belongs to whom is increasingly difficult to figure out, and avoiding the kind of cross reactions that happen in a lot of those spaces when you join all that motley crew of people together. It can get really, really difficult from a regulatory perspective as well. I see we're coming up at the top of the hour here, so before I ask you all to give a very awkward pandemic virtual event round of applause that none of us can see because this is in webinar mode for our excellent panelists today, I'll say thank you all for joining us today, and we hope that you'll join us again in the future for one of our events at the program on extremism. So please give a round of applause to our panelists, and